Okay, on to a new topic. Continuous integration and continuous deployment. This is one of the topics that when Dave and I started to put together the class, one of the guiding principles was what's different about software as a service. And at the time, I don't know that continuous integration was unique to software as a service, but I can say that in the intervening few years, continuous integration has become ubiquitous for software as a service in the way that I think it had never really become for shrink-wrap software. So what's the opposite of continuous integration and continuous deployment? When Windows 95 was released, they had a launch party. They licensed the song Start Me Up by the Rolling Stones to call attention to the brand new Start menu. That was the first time the Start menu appeared in Windows. They paid a huge amount of money to have the top of the Empire State Building in New York be lit up in the Windows colors. They had this big blowout event in, I assume, somewhere in Seattle during the 3 days of the year when it doesn't rain there. So releases used to be a really big deal, right? It was a milestone that resulted in these extravagant events. In contrast, what do software as a service companies typically do? Facebook, as of late 2011, they were pushing master once a week, so new code being rolled in at least that often. Amazon, for the Amazon.com site, was doing several deploys a week. Stack Overflow does multiple deploys per day. So does GitHub, by the way. They do tens of deploys per day. In other words, deployment has become so routine that it's not even almost a thing anymore. And in a way, that's very good, because the rationale is very similar to the rationale for engaging with the customer. The number of engineer hours invested since the last deployment is some measure of the risk that your next deployment won't be any good. Either it'll have a problem or it will fail to address the customer need that you hope to address. So it's kind of like features, right? If you can minimize that risk, and not only that, if you can get deployed to not be a big deal, the way you get good at doing something and make it not be a catastrophe is by doing it often and by automating it, right? This is why there are fire drills, because if you do a lot of fire drills, then the procedures that you'd have to use in a real fire are so familiar to you that it's unlikely you'll get them catastrophically wrong. So what does successful deployment mean these days? It means really automation. Everything about the deploy process that you can automate, you should automate. And fortunately, sites like Heroku and other cloud providers make it pretty easy to do this. At the same time, continuous integration has become a really, really key part of the deployment strategy, which means that every time, not only when you're deploying, but even when you're just pushing code to GitHub without deploying, you're always testing your app beyond what each developer is doing. So yes, the developers should be running the unit tests and scenarios and stuff like that, but maybe you've got additional tests that are very expensive, maybe too expensive for every developer to run all the time. Maybe you've got some additional checks like, is your code quality still high? I have been a strong advocate for the use of Code Climate as a CI tool. So continuous integration has become kind of front and center for a lot of these projects. So why would you run CI tests? If you're already doing testing while you're developing, what more can you get out of CI? One thing that CI has over your development environment is that it tends to be more like your production environment. So to the extent there are differences between your development and production environments, CI gets you a little bit closer to reality. It runs in a sort of, in an external environment. The app is completely separate from you. Whatever your tests are going to do, they have to be able to exercise that functionality outside of your dev environment to make sure that you haven't accidentally left any ties. If you need to do cross-browser testing, so for example, you might have some JavaScript code that you're not 100% sure is going to work with different browsers. In CI, you can have it tested against multiple different browsers or browser emulators, even though that would be probably too expensive to do every time you run all of your tests in the client side. Testing software, a service-oriented architecture integration when the remote services are acting wonky. So what happens if you have tests that are simulating, you're trying to call an external service and it times out or it returns a weird, garbagey response? Testing that in an environment that is out in the wild actually gives you some confidence that it'll work when you try to do it in production. We'll talk about a variety of attacks when we come back after spring break that will be very common against software as a service. And hardening your app against those attacks is another reason that you can use CI. There are things that you can do in that environment that are more like the kinds of attacks you might get in real life. You can do stress testing. There are certain features or certain behaviors that only arise after you've subjected the application to lots and lots of queries. Memory leak is a classic, but there are others as well. For example, database tables getting very large so that you can no longer get good performance without having some database indices. Doing those long-lived tests is not realistic for each developer, but it is something you can do in the cloud in CI. And as kind of a benchmark for this, Salesforce, as one example of software as a service, runs 150,000 tests in CI. They automatically open bug reports when a test fails, and they assign the bug report to whoever did the check-in that caused that first failure. And the interesting news is that a couple of years after I collected the statistic, you can now get that same functionality for small teams with the tools that are available for you guys to use. So what's continuous deployment? It basically just means that you're deploying your app to production, if possible, several times a day. If you're following this branch per feature methodology where master is always safe to deploy from, you've always rebased against master and make sure your merges are clean, then in some sense, there's no argument against doing a deploy to production every time you push something to master, right? And again, anytime that you do a deploy that has the risk of breaking something, the smaller the quantum between this deploy and the previous one, the more quickly you can figure out what you just broke. So does this mean that a release has no meaning anymore? Not necessarily, because for a customer, they might have requested, for example, a feature or a set of features that from their point of view, it's one feature, but from your point of view as the developers, it might take several pushes, several smaller stories before the feature is completely available. So the customer might not need to see the release every time, but when they do see it, it's an entire new chunk of functionality that's coming on board. It's very common in these projects to use the git tag command so that you can identify which particular commit corresponds to a customer visible release. So if you're not pushing every single master commit as out to production, one way that you can keep track of which ones were pushed out to production is to tag them. So that if the customer has found a particular bug, you also know which specific commit that bug might have occurred in. So given this brief discussion about CI and CD, let us ask this question. If Rotten Potatoes gets some new cool Ajax features, where does it make sense to test the features? You can test them locally in your dev environment with tools like Autotest and Guard and the testing tools we have. You can test them in CI. You can test them in a staging environment where you deploy the app interactively and it's not visible to the customer, but you can use it. Or you can use all of these.